All right. Good afternoon. Apologies for the repetition, but just hitting record. Welcome, everyone, to our latest class of the fellowship meeting for September 26th. A few words for our fellows as you are filtering in. Please, please, please engage in the Discord server. That is a way for us to more informally share information across our cohort. I would encourage you to reach out to other fellows from other schools, get a better read on what their research areas are. If you are having questions about what you might explore during our time together, it's a great opportunity to use, it's a great platform to use to talk about where you are thinking, what you may have been interested in previously, what are some new kernels of excitement or current events in your community that have inspired you to pivot or look at an area in a different way or from a different perspective. So please engage with that. As well, the deadline for your press releases is this Friday. So that is September 29th, close of business. Historically, I have received a number of those assignments after close of business on the Friday. So please get those into me as soon as they are completed. I will provide you with feedback and then provide some instructions on an appropriate means for dissemination. So know that what you are sending to me is an initial draft that I will respond and react to, and then you will be pursuing publication beyond that independently. So it does not have to be perfect, but should be ready for external eyes when it gets to me. Do you have any questions about the press release assignment, expectations for that? Okay. And again, one of the things I've put into the Discord server is a request for a greater insight into the availability of this class. So while I am happy to disseminate the recordings, it is obviously the ideal to have folks participate in this live. So if this time or the time on Thursdays does not consistently work for you, there is a question on Discord that is requesting your response, and I can look into rescheduling for the remainder of the semester. So please, again, engage, it would be greatly appreciated. I do not have insight into the schedules or the timetables of each of your individual schools, so I do require your vocal involvement to better inform how this might be structured going forward. All right. With all that being said, I am delighted today to be joined by two folks from RTI to talk to us about public perception surveys. So RTI is an independent nonprofit research institute dedicated to improving the human condition, recognizing that large remit, obviously public safety and security plays a very large role in that. And I previously shared their landscape report on measuring community sentiment and perceptions of safety and law enforcement performance, which I think builds upon quite well our conversation from last Thursday with the individuals from the International Association of Chiefs of Police. And so while IACP, we're talking about the need for law enforcement to focus internally on how they may be better equipped to respond to the needs of the community. This report also incorporates needs and the voices of community members on what it is that they are looking for in public safety and how law enforcement might better respond in keeping them safe. So today we are joined by two of those authors. We have Megan Camello, who is an innovation analyst. You'll excuse the sound of puppies and barking in the background. So Megan is a business, she focuses on the technology and market insights and strategic advising for federal, commercial, and university clients. She has a wealth of expertise and has previously advised NASA on technology transfer policies relating to the development market in commercial space and has supported the National Institute of Justice's Forensics Technology Center of Excellence and the Criminal Justice Testing and Evaluation Consortium. I will drop her bio into the chat for y'all. And as well, we are joined by Michael Planty, who is the director for the Center for Community Safety and Crime Prevention. He has a PhD with a concentration in justice, law, and society, public administration, and public policy from the School of Public Affairs right here in Washington, D.C. at American University. So Michael, Megan, thank you so much for joining us today. I hand the floor to you to give us more perspective on this great report. Oh, and Mike, you're on mute.
All right, pull the Zoomy, huh? So, okay, yeah, thanks for the invitation to present to this group. Really excited to showcase some of our work. Just a little context also. Before I joined RTI 7 years ago, I was deputy director at the Bureau of Justice Statistics, where I oversaw many of the national data collections on law enforcement, corrections, and the National Crime Victim Survey. So I've been working on community surveys and crime victim surveys for about 25 years. And so this report was really kind of an important aspect, and we'll get into in terms of really recognizing the value of community surveys over traditional measures and traditional metrics used to evaluate and engage with law enforcement community. So I don't know your format necessarily, but we welcome questions throughout, or I think we have plenty of material for the time, but I think if you have a question, just jump right in. Is that fine? Cool, great. All right, share my screen. So let me just get all your faces back up so I can see them. And you can see the slide deck okay? Great, all right. So just get right into the agenda. We'll figure out this in a little bit. So we wanted to give you a little overview about RTI and the CJ Tech project, just so you know where this is coming from. And then jump into the report. And the report is really focused around what's the purpose of community surveys, the use of community surveys in the field, the value of getting information from the community, and approaches. There's a lot of approaches that you can use to collect information from community, and there's pros and cons to each of those approaches. And you really have to think about what we call in the survey industry fit for purpose. What is your intention? What is your goal? And you pick those methods that are best and most appropriate. And then the latest innovations in this space. This is a really tired space when you think about it. People still rely on mail-out surveys and landline phone surveys and more cell surveys to get information from the community members, and they all have tremendous disadvantages and issues. And so we're going to showcase some of the latest innovations that we found when we conducted our landscape, and how they might be addressing many of the challenges to getting reliable, valid, and complete information from the field. So a quick overview on RTI, not a sales pitch at all. We're a nonprofit organization. We're a soft money organization. So we hustle every year conducting proposals and competing for proposals, primarily with the federal government and with state and local. We do an awful lot of partnering with law enforcement agencies. Well, in our group, the Justice Practice Area, with all actors across the criminal legal system, including victim service providers, law enforcement, corrections, jails, and prosecutors, and community corrections also. We're a pretty large organization based out of Research Triangle Park in North Carolina, but we have offices across the United States. We have around 6,000 people now. We deal, again, primarily with a soft money organization. We don't really sell anything besides our research capabilities. Practice areas are health, water, international, and the Justice Research Policy Group is what we're really working in. And again, the types of services we provide, we do surveys and data collection. We work with the Bureau of Justice Statistics on their large-scale collections to enumerate key points of the criminal justice system. How many law enforcement agencies are there? How many people are in reentry programs? Things like that. And we do large-scale evaluations. So we actually conduct, if in this case, law enforcement agency is adopting a certain policy or practice, we try to look how to evaluate that, if it's really performing as it should, and are there any unintended consequences? We also do laboratory work and other types of analytical laboratory and R&D work around engineering. So the justice practice area is what I sit in. There's about 200 people, primarily a mix of researchers from multidisciplinary teams. We are really focused on community safety, one center, forensic science, policing and investigative science, and courts and corrections. And again, each one of these centers have folks that have public health, criminology, econometrics, all kinds of different backgrounds, working both from early career BA to PhDs on these problems. So this project that we're talking about that spun out these reports is called the Criminal Justice Testing and Evaluation Consortium. It's funded by the National Institute of Justice, which is the research arm of DOJ, and it sits within the director's office. It's meant to really pull together the latest emerging technologies and policies that are coming out onto the field in an effort to better understand how they can serve what we call community cops and courts and corrections. It's divided into 4 tasks. The first task in the lower left you see is tech foraging. That's what we're talking about here. We go out and look for technology that is being pushed onto the criminal justice system or could be useful for the criminal justice system. And the testing and evaluation is we look at these different products and we actually do testing and evaluation, whether it's in a lab setting or in the field. So a variety of different methods from bench examinations to going into the field and looking at the fidelity of a program, process, and outcome evaluations. The compliance testing program is probably our most concrete. We actually test all the body armor that is produced across the country for primarily law enforcement, but also correctional officers. So we have a program where vendors submit body armor, and we have labs, we call them laboratories, but they're shooting ranges across the country that will test them at different threat levels, from 9mm to larger rounds. And then if they pass the standards that have been established from the industry, they get a stamp of approval. And the law enforcement community, the 18,000 law enforcement agencies out there, look for that stamp, and they're eligible for funding and also a guarantee that it has met certain threat levels. And that program is an initial testing, and then every year we retest because we know vendors love to cut corners, and they'll pass the initial test, and then body armor has multiple layers. They might, instead of 13 layers, they might go down to 12 layers in production or something like that. And so we constantly have to stay on vendors to really make sure that they're meeting those standards. And the equipment standards is around primarily law enforcement PPE, personal protection equipment, including body armor, helmets, and pistol standards. And it's a little bit different. Law enforcement, their body armor is designed primarily for ballistics, whereas in a correctional facility, your body armor is more for stab resistance. And body armor performs, you might not know this, but very differently from a high-speed projectile. Certain body armors will stop it, but won't stop a stab. So we look at different standards within those different environments. So in terms of tech foraging, these are the priorities we've set. Priorities are set. We're under a cooperative agreement with NIJ, Department of Justice. So we look at their strategic priorities they have. We look at another project that gets practitioners in the room and to try to really understand their needs around certain issues. And we pull this together and we come up with our monitoring and ideation process. So we've been focusing on AI, ballistics, autonomous vehicles, forensics, drones is a really big space right now. You have drones that obviously are used by first responders to search and rescue and into other types of things. But drones are being used for nefarious purposes too. One of the big ones is flying drugs and contraband into correctional facilities. Happens every day, hundreds of times a day in certain areas. And they'll just drop small packages in a large space, and they do all kinds of inventive things, right? They'll stuff a dead animal with it and fly it over and drop it in the field. They'll throw footballs over, but drones are the quick and easy thing to just fly over and drop it right in a facility, on the roof, on garbage bags, other types of things. South Carolina just maybe not last year, the year before, they recovered in their facilities. I think they have 24 correctional facilities, over 7,000 cell phones, which is a huge contraband for a variety of reasons. And drugs, of course, are another big thing that are often flown. So we're looking at that, and a few other things. I'm happy to talk about these other things in terms of maybe some of the topics you've been talking about. How we go about our business. So if we have a topic such as community perceptions or any other technology, we go and review the literature. We say, what's the state of the science? We look at the scientific literature. We look at the gray literature. We go to vendors. We talk to them. We don't believe anything they say, but it's kind of hard. Vendors will sell you almost anything, and but we gather their spec sheets and their performances that they might have on their products. Then we go to practitioners. We interview people actually using the products in the field or engaged in it. Law enforcement, courts, cops, corrections, those types of folks. And we don't stop there. We actually go to community stakeholders, CBOs, city managers, other types of key stakeholders in a jurisdiction that may be really interested in the outcome. Community perceptions is a big one, right? And we'll talk about that a little bit. And we pull this together into a report, so we have a kind of balanced perspective. We understand what the vendors are saying. We understand that what users' needs are, and anyone using a product in the field, what have been the challenges or the successes related to those products. So that's the type of thing you'll see in our reports. We also, when we go about this, we have a framework for understanding technology. We often think about technology, does it work? But there's a larger framework you need to consider when adopting technology. So the first column here in blue is really about technical. Does it do what it says it does, right? And you'll be surprised at a lot of technology does not perform like the vendors say it does. You can go into a clean, so we're evaluating contraband tool to detect cell phones and drugs as a pass-through person. And if you do it in a laboratory setting, it's fine. But now drag that to a prison, a 100-year-old prison in Georgia, where there's 2-foot cement walls and metal bars all around, in a very different setting, and see if that same technology will perform. And it doesn't. We'll just let you know there. So we look at the quality of these things, privacy and security, compatibility with integration. So most folks, they already have technology or using something else. How does this new product integrate? The second part is really around operational. It's really about, who's going to use the technology. If you have to give something really complex to a correctional officer who may have very limited educational training and capabilities, are you going to expect that to work out well, right? So how much training is needed and how much retraining over time? Data management and governance, huge. Who owns the data that you're collecting? Who can get access to it? How is it interpreted? So you collect a whole bunch of data, especially this community perception stuff we'll get into. Who has the right to analyze it and to interpret it? Really important. Are there legal and regulatory issues? So you might, the drone thing is another thing. Most people don't know that if a drone is flying over your head, if you engage in it, it's just like engaging with an airplane. And so you can't shoot a drone out of the air. Only 4 agencies are allowed to mitigate a drone. DHS, FBI, those, you can guess. 18,000 law enforcement are not allowed to shoot a drone out. It's an FAA regulation. And it's a really hot topic because, there's 1,700 correctional facilities in the United States where they're at risk. Soft targets like Disney, Super Bowl, all these other places where drones are flown over. And so we have actually a brief on drones and contraband if you want to go check that out, and all the rules that almost nobody across the United States are familiar with when they see a drone. But those are the types of things we're considering. And then the final one is societal consideration. You adopt technology, it could perform and have a law enforcement function and do quite well. But what are the ethical concerns? What are concerns around equity? License plate readers are agnostic, right? They just read something, they have an algorithm, boom. But someone has to place them somewhere, right? So if you take the license plate readers and you put them in, say, historically marginalized communities, then guess what? You're going to have a whole bunch of traffic citations for people who are black and brown individuals, right? And then you look at your record system, and you say, wow, black and brown people speed or break all kinds of traffic issues. But it's only because you place those readers and those radars in those areas. So being really cautious about the interpretation and overuse, the over policing of communities is something that we're really interested in. And finally, how it impacts community trust. There's this old emphasis on over policing, but there's also this concern about under policing. And if you're familiar, over policing, you just stop and frisk is kind of the thing that everyone points to, where you're just stopping people all the time. But the under policing is not reacting to things, right? So when a homicide happens, how many resources are put towards solving that compared to other communities? And so when you're over policed and underserved, basically, those are huge issues. And technology is really at the center of that today, with facial recognition, license plate readers, and anything else you can think about. Going quickly here, but everything good? Just if you want to jump in. Okay, good. And just to give you a sense of the types of landscapes or reports we're doing, landscape study on DUID, driving under the influence of drugs. Now with the relaxation of marijuana laws, this has become a huge issue. Traditional sobriety tests, field sobriety tests that a law enforcement officer might use, work for blood alcohol, but they don't work for marijuana detection, right? There's some technology emerging, but THC reacts differently, breaks down differently in your bloodstream than alcohol does. So it gets to less around drug use and more around distracted driving, right? Driving, under the influence is going to be a really interesting thing to look at in the future. AI in law enforcement, how can artificial intelligence be applied to the law enforcement activities? In the guardrails around those types of devices. We have things, artificial intelligence in criminal court proceedings with prosecutors. We're seeing ChatGPT come out and be really useful for lawyers, especially in court proceedings, but also causing many concerns in terms of providing false information, or they call hallucinations around. It looks like it's real, but what they're really producing is just not centered at all on any reliable data. We have an evaluation of mental health apps application for law enforcement officers. So a big concern around law enforcement is depression, suicide ideation, and also huge events in terms of what they do on a day-to-day basis, responding to domestic violence, child abuse, and how that plays out in terms of their activities. So for example, you give a death notification to one family, and then you drive down the street a half hour later and respond to a noise ordinance, and it just escalates because you're still dealing with that last event you just had. So how do these mental health wellness apps come into play? Traditionally, no one wants to say, yeah, I'm having a mental health issue, right? If you're a law enforcement officer, because I'm going to be taken off the job. People are going to see me differently. They might not want to work with me. So these apps provide law enforcement community a private setting to access resources they might not have access to or don't want to reveal. So we're looking at the impact of that, how they're used, what types of resources people are looking at, and if there's any impact on things like sick out, complaint behavior, these types of things. And then monitoring technologies for community supervision. This kind of exploded during COVID, during social distancing, where case managers didn't want to go in person to check on people on probation and parole. So these smartphone apps and other types of technologies became really important to monitoring people, where they are they at work, are they at school, are they at places they should be, based on their conditions of release. So these are the types of things that we're looking at that might be useful. Our latest thing is the quadruped robots that have come out. So we have a report underway that's looking at the impact there. As you can imagine, the community perceptions and optics around these robots have become a major concern. Robots have been around law enforcement since the 70s, right? They've been always used, but these things are a little bit creepier, right? And just trying to get a sense of how they can be used. And the report really talks about all the great things. Search and rescue, they were just using search and rescue in New York City when a building collapsed. Dangerous situations where personnel can't get in because maybe it's a hazardous biohazard situation. Well, you can throw a robot in there. You can do a lot of really good things with these robots. But at the same time, people are concerned about the weaponization of the robots. Can they be used for other types of surveillance? You put a facial recognition camera on that and just let it go around during civil disturbance, and it's just capturing everybody's face and hitting a large database. So that type of surveillance is another major concern. Generative AI, I talked about before, that's coming out, and people are looking for applications. Law enforcement is a little bit not that great right yet, but the court system definitely is seeing generative AI as something useful. And then augmented and virtual reality, how can we improve training with law enforcement officers and correctional officers in terms of how they engage with the community? So training around someone with a disability, how do you approach that person? Someone under a mental health crisis or substance use disorder, what's the best approach to that? And that's hard to simulate, right? So, but with augmented and virtual reality, you can provide that type of training on a routine and regular basis to law enforcement officers, especially agencies that are rural or small that can't afford in-person training. Of the 18,000, 50% of those 18,000 had 10 or fewer FTEs. So you're talking, the United States is patrolled, and the law enforcement community has close to 9,000 agencies that have 10 or fewer full-time sworn, right? These are small little places that have significant power when you think about it, and might not have the right training or resources. Okay, so that's what that is all about. We can jump now into where we're here for, is the community perception report. And this has come up, it's been around for an awful long time, how to measure the value of measuring perceptions from the community about their law enforcement activities and about other things related to their personal safety and emerging issues in the community. More recently, before I go on, most people evaluate law enforcement by two things, right? Is crime up or down? And did you do something terrible, right? A sentinel event. Did you shoot somebody, or is there some sort of corruption going on? And those are insufficient, right? You might not, 90% of the 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the United States have 0 homicides in their jurisdiction in a given year. So the concern about the homicide issue is really local. Now, where is it? It's in the 70 largest cities in America, right? Account for well over 50% of homicide. But for the rest of them, using violent crime as an indicator is insufficient, right? And while it's important for those agencies, you're thinking about the metrics of evaluation, it becomes more complicated. And then second, corruption is hugely important, and the need for oversight is incredible, and this ties in with this. But again, you're going to have very little, of the thousands of individuals that are involved with officer-involved shootings a year, best estimate we can get, 18,000 law enforcement agencies, over 90% don't have an officer-involved shooting in a given year. And when you look over time, if they have one, they're less likely to have another following. There's a small cluster of agencies, mainly the large ones. You could think of LA, some of the other, Phoenix, Tucson, Chicago, Miami, that may have multiple shootings in a given year. So even looking at sentinel events, it's not a good indicator of police performance or activity. So the value of the community perspective brings in a whole set of indicators from the voice of the community that really gets at accountability. So the purpose for this report is really around recently the George Floyd incident, the tensions that were surfacing, but no one was measuring with the community, based on these sentinel events. Sentinel events are really a tip of the iceberg, if you will, in terms of how law enforcement engages with the community. The 24th Century Policing Report conducted on the Obama administration laid out multiple recommendations in terms of rethinking how law enforcement should work. One of those recommendations is to conduct community surveys and to engage with the community on a real time It's not you, the law enforcement agency and the community. They should be working hand in hand, usually with the city or county representatives. And that calls for increased transparency, increased cooperation, and coordination, something that's often lacking, right? And then traditional approaches to community surveys are just super inefficient. They're super expensive. They take so much time just to get a snapshot. You might send out a survey and you have to wait 6 months to see what, that one point in time, what people are thinking. And they tend to have concerns around bias, particularly about reaching those people most impacted by crime and most impacted by policing. It's really often not the case when we look at these surveys. They're missing big chunks of individuals in high crime areas, impoverished communities. They just don't respond to traditional surveys. They don't have the trust that these surveys are really about getting information. You're right. They really think, oh, they're collecting information about me to get me, kind of thing. And there's really not that cooperation. They don't feel like they should help the police because the police are not helping them. So we had to think about new ways to approach getting information from the community. And that was the point of this report. So who currently conducts surveys? Well, left to right, I think that's what we're looking at. On the left side, large agencies with 100 plus FTEs are more likely to conduct a survey compared to those that are 10 or fewer. And like I stated earlier, the 10 or fewer are over half the law enforcement agencies in the country. And there's differences. The light blues, MPDs, municipal police departments, they're more likely than sheriff offices. And we know that's an important. Sheriff offices, they're a very interesting group of folks. They're political, right? They get elected versus police chief in New York City is usually under the control of the mayor or some other organization. So the sheriffs they're the political candidate, and they're less likely to cooperate with almost any national collection, based on my experience with Bureau of Justice statistics. They think of crime and their jurisdictions as local. And you can see going from a very large agency, immediately when you get to even the smaller 50 to 99, the sheriffs drop way off. And they're just not doing these things. Another thing related to this is the resources. Again, many of these small places don't have the resources to conduct a survey. They're really costly. If you go to an independent contractor, many times they'll go with an academic or university partner to conduct them. And they're of a limited quality, to be quite honest. But when they do conduct them, what do they do it for? They really want to understand gaps in services, measure effectiveness of interventions. So they may roll out a new community engagement program, right? Or have coffee with a cop, or something like that. And they want to know if they're really reaching the community. They want to look at allocation, resource allocation. Where are the problems? Are we hitting the neighborhoods and communities that we really need to be in? Looking for areas for improvement. And then also to recognize positive service. We often think about looking at complaints and other negative things, but there's the flip side, and we'll touch on this later, but the body-worn camera, whole adoption of body-worn camera has proven to be super positive for law enforcement in many ways, because it's been highlighting the really positive interactions they have with the community, and the majority of interactions with law enforcement are positive. But that tends to be, under recognized, I would say. The real main driver, I would say, for a survey to an agency to conduct a survey is for accreditation. There's a national law enforcement accreditation, and there's also many state accreditations. And almost all of them have to conduct a survey every 2 years, and they do it. And it tends to be, just a very simple survey they put out. They might say, go to this website, and like next door neighbors, or is it next door neighbors, right? Or Facebook, to put a survey out on Facebook, and you can vote like Chicago style, often and early, right? Early and often. So there's really no control over quality, reliability, or validity. It's really about, okay, we're going to do it, and they don't really socialize the results often. They just conduct it, put a stamp on it, may take something back. So it's really important as we move on to really gain a better understanding of how a reliable, valid survey can be very useful for operational purposes. And we'll showcase a little of that. So, like I said, there's community surveys are really important for measuring things that you can't get through traditional sources. You're not going to get these through police records, right, of crime records. There's only one way to get it, and it's get it by asking the community around effectiveness. How effective are you? Now, maybe you can get that through operational, right? Is crime go down when we do hotspots, or if we do certain types of training, etc. But in terms of perceptions, do you think the police are effective at controlling crime? Do you think police are effective at what they do? Fear and safety. That's the only way you can get is through a community survey. How safe are you walking the streets at night? How safe do you feel in your routine activities? Do you feel you'll be a victim of crime, right? Those types of things. And risk and fear are very different. What we tend to see there is like older people are more fearful, but they're less at risk at becoming a victim of crime because of their routine activities. They're not putting themselves in a position where they're at high risk. Levels of satisfaction. This is another really interesting one that Meg will touch on. It's when you do have an interaction with law enforcement personnel, whether it's a police-initiated stop, like a street stop or a vehicle stop, or a citizen-initiated 911 call, or some other type of emergency. How satisfied were you with that response? And that gets really important because it talks about now trust building, which have been shown to the better trust you have in a community with law enforcement, it leads to better cooperation, to better crime solving, to better case clearances. You can also ask about social disorganization and emerging crime problems. So the police might see things that are happening, but they're not seeing other things. And so what's important to the community to be solved? Often we see this as, it's quality of life issues, right? And because that's the most impactful thing on people. Like, what's the most disruptive thing to their day-to-day activities? Violent crime might be, but for many communities, it gets into other types of things that the police can help with. And then procedural justice and legitimacy ties to level of satisfaction. That's where, if you did have engagement with law enforcement, did they treat you with respect, right? Did you feel like it was a legitimate stop? And that gets into another area where do you have any perceptions of legitimacy of your local law enforcement? And that goes a long way towards this whole notion of building community engagement. This is a graphic we like to show because when you start talking about community perceptions, well, how do people form their perceptions of law enforcement? That bottom line is really talking about those sources of influences. So calling 911, traffic stops, have you been arrested? Did you witness a crime or police responding to a crime? Have you been a crime victim? Simple observation. So you're out, you might not engage with law enforcement, but you're walking through a park and you see law enforcement doing different things, right? Sitting in their car, maybe getting out, walking around, riding bikes. So based on that observation. Movies and television, huge source of how people perceive law enforcement. And experience it by family and friends. So your brother might have been arrested or stopped and you take that in. And so those vicarious experiences are really important because when you look at who actually gets stopped and who actually has any engagement with law enforcement in a given year, it's not a huge percentage of people. And so in any given year, very few people have direct contact with law enforcement for reporting incident or any kind of safety. And then the news and social media we all talk about now, the information or disinformation of social media, right? And trying to understand that. Most importantly, I live in Rockville, Maryland, and any given day, there's probably 5 different law enforcement agencies that can arrest me and engage me. I got Montgomery County Police, Montgomery County Sheriff, I have the state police, right next to the park police. And the list goes on. I go into Rockville Police, Gaithersburg Police. I'm sure there's an FBI agent in the neighborhood that could do some. But so when you think about your perceptions of law enforcement, I ask you, do you think the police are doing a good job? If someone asked me that, I was like, which police? You know, you have to think about that. There's very few places that have just one law enforcement agency. Most counties, you have the county sheriff, right? And they're primarily responsible for jail operations and detention. And then you have the different law enforcement agencies, municipal agencies, the town, the cities, all you know, peppered in within that county. And so thinking about that engagement is really important. And the other thing is in DC, you think about the community, or the police doing a good job. Well over 50% of the people they stop don't live in DC proper, right? They're commuters, they're tourists, they're coming in for nightlife, those types of things. So again, where are you getting your information? You're going to have selection bias, as we put it, in terms of how you get your information. And Meg is going to talk about the different sources and the value of that. But most importantly, when you think back, and I always anchor myself with the Michael Brown Ferguson incident, law enforcement community always said, well, law enforcement is local, right? And that was always a pressure to cooperate with the federal, why do you need my crime data? Why do you need to know how many complaints I have, or even use of force, or even the FBI's use of force database, right? 40% compliance right now. And this whole narrative around deaths in custody, that we don't have a single database for the nation that counts the number of people that die while in pursuit of custody or engaged in law enforcement. The in custody thing is a little bit tricky because most people that are killed by police are not technically in custody, right? They're either officer involved shootings, in vehicle pursuits is the second thing. So high speed chase are the two major ones that people die from when they're involved with law enforcement. Unlike a jail setting where you are technically in custody, and very different situation. There you're talking about suicide, talking about intoxication, you talk about illness. And in a prison setting, 90% of people that die in prison are from illness related, and then suicide and intoxication. And so very different sectors, but in law enforcement, the whole notion that it was local just went away after the Michael Brown, right? A small town like Ferguson exploded across the country, Baltimore, Oakland, everywhere else based on that event. And it just really revealed the tensions within communities, especially marginalized communities, about their relationships with law enforcement. And so this kind of graphic shows where you have an officer kind of bubble, and then it goes up to incident, and it has that ripple effect to law enforcement and to law enforcement in general. So what happens within your agency with one officer can impact your whole agency and how everyone interacts with that agency. But it also impacts everyone's perception of law enforcement in general. And so you get to these large issues about, is law enforcement broken, right? Or is it, just a one-off? Ferguson was just a one-off. It's a bad agency. We got a federal, consent decree. Let's go in there, fix it. But is that really true? So understanding as a profession how officer behavior incidents can ripple through the profession is really important. And I think that's being recognized by IACP, by other associations more and more, and understanding the true value of the underlying sentiment and perceptions of law enforcement in their community. So with that, I think I'm turning it over to Meg. I think you're probably all sick of me talking, but Meg's now going to turn to describing the different approaches that are out there to gather this information around community perceptions of law enforcement.
Awesome. Thanks, Mike.
Yep.
So the landscape report that we wrote looked at 3 different approaches to measuring community perceptions. The first being general population surveys. General population surveys are surveys that are sent out to an entire community or a random representative sample of a community. The measures that Mike showed earlier, they're good at measuring several of those because they're highly customizable. So think of things like can measure emerging community issues if you ask a question about that. It can measure public safety and fear of crime. It can measure effectiveness. Unlike post-contact surveys, which I'll talk about in a second, people that are responding to general population surveys are less likely to have had an interaction with law enforcement. So it's possible that their perceptions could be influenced by some of those external sources that Mike spoke about on the last slide. So social media, movies, how their sister interacted last week with the law enforcement. Another kind of limitation of general population surveys is that those most affected by crime may be reluctant to respond to a survey because they have the greatest distrust in policing. Post-contact surveys are different. They involve they're typically administered after a interaction takes place between a law enforcement officer and a resident. That could be with a traffic stop, that could be someone calling for service, could be through a crime investigation. But these surveys, all the individuals that are taking them had some interaction with law enforcement. So that's why this type of survey is really good at measuring levels of satisfaction and perceptions of procedural justice and legitimacy. One of the limitations of this is that they can be vulnerable to influence and bias. And then the third approach that we looked at is it's a little bit of a catch-all, but there's different ways and new technologies enabling us to look at different data sources where we can aggregate disparate information sources using tools like AI, natural language processing, sentiment analysis to derive perceptions from different sources. So think social media or body-worn camera, video, and audio. I'll talk in a little bit about kind of more details of that, but extract the text from social media and kind of detect whether it's positive, negative, or neutral sentiment. Again, social media is maybe a little bit biased because it's influenced by a lot of national events. So perceptions may not reflect a specific agency, but overall general perceptions of law enforcement in general. Want to go to the next slide? So the traditional modes for surveying the community about law enforcement uses different approaches. So you can use mail, telephone, in-person interviews, and web-based surveys. And as Mike said, there's several limitations to these. So they can be costly, they take a long time, and it's just, you're getting a moment in time measurement. Some of these have very limited coverage, so web and telephone. And then also the data quality can be affected if there's an interviewer involved. So because there's a lot of limitations with these traditional approaches or traditional modes, we wanted to look at emerging and innovative ways that people are doing surveys. So if you can go to the next slide, there's 3 ways or technology-enabled modes that are kind of emerging in the law enforcement sphere. That's digital advertisement, text, and QR codes. And the icons you see below are the different companies that are offering solutions in these spaces tailored specifically for law enforcement. So I'm going to talk about each one individually now. So if you can go to the next slide. Digital advertisements are, so if you're ever on like Facebook, Instagram, any web page, you'll see ads for anything and everything. Digital advertisement networks are spaces on websites or iPhone apps that are traded on behalf of companies. So the publisher of the website leases the space to a third-party advertisement network and then auctions that space to a company. So in this case, the only company that's really engaging in this in terms of doing it for survey purposes is a company called Zensity. And so they purchase these spaces and they push general population surveys through these leased spaces. Zensity uses census data to target representative samples of the community. And because of all the data that Apple and all the phone providers have on us, they can be pretty precise in the demographics that they target with these ads. So for example, if Zensity has a certain quota for a specific demographic that they don't meet on one day, they can adjust the targeting for the following day to get more of that demographic. So think maybe yesterday they noticed a low response rate for 18 to 24-year-old white men. They can, the following day, find specific apps or web pages in which white 18 to 24-year-old white males go on. So Instagram, Reddit, and push ads to those and then get more of that response. So digital ad surveys, they kind of seemingly address some of the issues with the traditional approaches because it's improved timeliness because you're getting continuous measurements every day instead of sending one mail out survey once a year. You're continuously getting measurements. Another benefit of this type of technology is that there's improved coverage because I think it's like 97% of Americans have cell phones, 85% of them smartphones. So there's a wealth of people that can reply to these surveys and have access to them. I think that's all I wanted to say about digital advertising. It's a very, oh, Mike, do you want to jump in?
I was going to say, you know, this whole approach, and the founder of Zen City actually worked on the Obama campaign and used this exact technique to get access to voters. So it has very good geocoded location, and so you can get precise neighborhood level estimates, which is really tough to do, but also targeting various demographic groups, and not just, you know, your traditional characteristics, LGBTQ. You go down the list, you can find rich, poor, because people hang out in different places in the cyberspace. And if you have that information, because you've called that already, you know, you can put that together and you can go, like Meg said, and target various platforms to get those responses that you need. So it's been proven effective. We're still out on in terms of whether it's good, that type of evaluation still hasn't been conducted. We're looking to do that. So to compare what Zen City gets to like a gold standard survey that's conducted in person on the ground, and you know where you're getting the information. But I think they have over 150 cities that are currently using Zen City.
Yeah, and some of the largest agencies I know are using it. They have, like Mike mentioned, very specific geocoding. So we talked with several agencies that are using it, and they shared the dashboard that they get, and they can get down to not the street level, but the pretty deep insights at the jurisdiction level, at the different like micro levels within a city.
And that's been a cause of concern because in one jurisdiction, they found out, and because the city was not communicating to the community that they were using it, they perceived it as their surveillance. They were perceiving that, okay, we're going to capture anyone who said something negative about the police, and then the police are going to go in and get after the community. It was actually New York City. It's in the paper, but a few years ago. And so it's really important about, again, how you engage the community. One thing we heard over and over with practitioners is that they wanted to do it, all good intention, but they never engaged the community about what they were measuring, or even thought about on the back end, all right, now we got this data, how are we going to release it? So huge, and you know, I mean, these are big places too. They had a lot of resources, and they were pretty open about that lack of preparation. So it's interesting, and this has come up again with other technology, facial recognition, and you go down the list. All right.
Awesome. So text message. So text message surveys, again, they're pushing surveys directly to someone's phone. The companies that are providing this service often tie in to an agency's CAD or RMS system, which automates the service, the survey delivery. Typically, the companies that offer this service are sending a hyperlink in a text message, and then they click on the hyperlink and they fill out the web-based survey. There is one, Power DMS, which is highlighted here. They actually send the questions within the body of the text. So it'll be like, rate your interaction from 1 to 10, and then the person texts their rating back, then they'll send another question, and then the individual will respond again. So that's an emerging way that's not too popular yet. Again, we see bolstered response rate with text message surveys because you can, because you have the phone number and it's automated, you can send follow-ups and reminders, and improved accessibility because you're not mailing something where someone has to send it back. It's mobile friendly and it's at their fingertips. You're meeting them where they're at. A potential limitation of the text message survey, especially for a provider like Power DMS, where you're responding within the text message, is that you could respond and press the wrong number, which could influence the quality of the data. And again, though it does improve accessibility in some aspects, there is obviously some people that don't have cell phones, so you're potentially missing those people when you're using this method. And then QR codes, obviously QR codes grew in popularity because of COVID, and I think most restaurants use them now, but they can also be printed on any type of collateral. So business cards, they can be printed on citations, and they can direct individuals to surveys. I think most often we're seeing them put on the back of business cards, and then law enforcement will after they pull someone over and they do what they're supposed to do, they'll give them a business card, and then the person can scan the QR code and take the survey. There's it's a pretty low tech option. So there's a lot of companies that are offering this solution. Again, there's improved timeliness because there's continuous data that's being updated every day. And all the companies that offer this type of platform, they have analytics dashboards that aggregate the data and kind of break it down by time of day. It can get targeted, so the QR code can be unique to an officer. So how Officer Smith's interactions are going versus Officer Joe. The limitations is there could be issues with coverage because obviously not everyone that interacts with the police will have the opportunity to respond to a survey. And there's accessibility issues because not everyone may have a phone, or people may have a phone but not know what a QR code is and not be able to scan it. So you're potentially missing people there as well. So this is getting into the third approach that we're talking about, the catch-all, leveraging existing data. So one of the ways that companies and people are doing this is using sentiment analysis of social media to understand sentiment about law enforcement. So there's dozens of tools out there that can do this, typically for like consumer-facing companies to get a reading on their brand. But there is a couple companies that are doing this. Well, there's one company specifically, Zensity, they're kind of playing in all these fields, but they are doing this specifically for law enforcement and government. And they pull data from social media platforms, from media and web sources, and they identify trends related to the community's sentiment. Although this type of tool provides a lot of benefits, most poignantly, they can collect and analyze data daily, and it allows you to get like a trend analysis over time. There are some limitations because sentiment analysis only provides one general indicator of policing, and there could be coverage issues because not everyone uses social media, and then people on social media could be outside the community, so you're not getting a real read on the residents within a community's perception. But again, user-friendly dashboard, you can think word walls, you can see like trends over time, you can correspond that to specific events that may have happened in a community. So if like an officer involved shooting happens in August, then you can see how does that impact the sentiment on social media in September and October.
I think a couple of other things to point out is that this relies on a large language model, and that has to be trained. So what that means is that you take a sentence or a tweet and you break it down, or X they call it now, right? The cool kids. So and you have to classify that. So you have to train the model to say, this is a positive, this is neutral, and this is negative. What these machine learning models are bad at picking up are snarky comments and jokes and things like that. They can't really discern when someone's just screwing around, right? And you know, social media, that's all people do, right? is to be do those types of things. So you end up with you know, a really crude indicator, whether it's positive or negative. The other thing is that, you know, social media, 30 to 40% are bots, right? They're not individuals. They're controlled by corporations or associations, and so you can identify them often through other types of characteristics, but you still have to sort through those. And then you have, like Megan responded to, you might have some event that goes viral and it just blows up your indicator, right? And whether it's a minor event or something goofy, it still will change the indicator. And so you kind of have to insulate your indicator from those sentinel events, if you will. And now it might be an important sentinel event. It might be an officer involved shooting, right? And then all of a sudden you get a huge negative, right? And so understanding those you know, impacts on your indicator, if you're really going to use it, are those things are really important to acknowledge.
The other data source that we looked at in that leveraging existing data bucket was the use of body-worn camera video and audio data to get at measures of community perceptions. So body-worn camera data can be analyzed to gain insights into the demeanor, emotions, and behaviors of law enforcement officers and the community member that they had an interaction with. There is a couple companies that are offering this type of service. I think Trulio is an example of one of these, and they specifically do body-worn camera audio analysis and aren't looking at the video. So they take the body-worn camera footage, they basically transcribe the body-worn camera footage, and they use a combination of speech transcription and natural language processing to analyze the body-worn camera audio. And then they classify the audio to measure like the risky behaviors and the respectful interactions. Again, this is only providing one general indicator of policing, whether it's good or bad. And it's pretty new and emerging. So I know we talked to an agency that was trialing and piloting this, and they were doing a lot of work towards refining the model, the AI model. And they actually had officers who were on desk duty. They were given audio segments and they had that were transcribed, and they listened to it, and then they confirmed if the transcription was accurate, or if it wasn't, they edited it. And then they would use tags to manually say if it was positive or negative. And this went into training the model that Trulio uses. Again, it's very early, and it's one indicator, but it has potential.
Yeah, you know, and the company, again, looking back, you know, who started this company? Well, there's a bunch of folks on Wall Street that were looking at employee customer texts and phone calls. And they're taking this large language model, breaking it down to say, how are you interacting with other companies? Like Bank of America was one company they served. And then they took this and now put it into this a venue. And the other challenges here, it just relies on audio. They're trying to move to video, and that's a whole different kind of, because now you're looking at images and interactions, often from a very, you know, constricted viewpoint. And this right here, you can see the back and forth, the cadence that, you know, a positive one. It's a one-on-one. Often you don't have a one-on-one, right? You have a body video, and there might be a whole bunch of people yelling in the background. You're talking. So the machine also has to pick up and attribute the voice to certain people, right? So you may have two officers talking at the same time, and then a couple of people in the background. So that's a real challenge there versus like a traffic stop where you might be one-on-one with somebody through a car door. So it's very promising, and it's independent one of the things here, it is an indicator, but it also can be used for training for law enforcement. So what agencies are starting to do is they have all this body worn camera information, and they're not using it at all until there's an event, and then they go pull it. But what people are looking to do is take a random sample of their officers, go review it, run it through the system, and say, oh, well, look at Officer Bob. Look at how positive his interactions are, right? But Officer Sam, you know, he's kind of split half and half. What's going on here? Let's go talk to him and think about it. Maybe it's an early warning system. It could be also a system where you're identifying a training need. So they're being proactive around the use of this and not just reactive. And so there's another company called Polis. They're not on market yet, but they're trying to get. And I think those are the two that are really in this space. And I think it's a really interesting data source for another, you know, for research in general. That's what gets us a little geeked up a little bit too. Because it's independent, right? You know, you do have some things that, you know, when does a camera go on, when does it shut off, you know? So there might be selection bias there in terms of the types of incidents that you're seeing. But overall, it's a promising tool.
I'll also say, because they're focused right now just on the audio piece, it's not picking up tone or body language that could influence like someone's perception of, like, if someone were to manually do it, that could change if you understood the tone or the body language. But because they're just taking the transcription and attributing positive or negative, there could be things that are missed there.
So I guess you can really be nice when you say these things on the red side.
Right.
Is back to me, or?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks, Mike. So yeah, just, you know, what's the impact? You know, what we're hearing from the field, you know, is that it's a really important report. You know, we initially set out to do about 25, 30 page. We really want reports that practitioners can approach and to read. This turned into about an 85, 90 page report based on, you know, I think we spoke to well over 50 different individuals to inform this research. And you know, it's really serving to be an important tool, research tool, as the NHA director is looking towards, because you know, again, conducting a survey traditionally is expensive. It takes so much time, and so looking for novel methods to collect information that's reliable and valid, of course. So a couple of takeaways that we got. You know, it's really important to measure community perceptions. There's really unique metrics that you can get from only community members outside of crime data. There's new technology that's promising, cost effective, it's fast, geographic specific information that's really important. What we're seeing, like in Seattle and other jurisdictions, Seattle PD just came off of consent decree after 12 years. Part of their consent decree, they engage in the community in multiple ways. They're taking a layered approach. They're doing the general population survey, post-contact survey, and doing sentiment analysis also with body-worn camera. I think they parked a body-worn camera for some reasons. There are some issues with body-worn camera with dealing with victims of crime in terms of protecting the rights of victims. So there's some issues there. But they're taking a layered approach to understand these different sources of information and how they can inform their operation. They're really concerned about how they can move the needle in terms of training and performance. But all of these technologies need to be evaluated right now. They're fresh, they're new, and even traditional survey approaches have waned. Many people don't participate in surveys anymore. When you get a mail survey or phone survey, unless you're thrown in a couple bucks, right? And you might be compelled or coerced to respond. Depends on your IRB. But these types of things need to be evaluated for not only whether they're reliable, but their coverage. Are they really addressing the challenges of finding folks most impacted by policing and crime and getting their perspectives? Are they really comprehensive, and are they accurate? You know, a big thing I've always dealt with is that you can ask a question, but there's measurement error, right? And what's tolerable. So, you know, the classic one is like, how old are you? And well, I say 53. and I'm not 53, I'm 53 in 2 months and 1 day and how many hours, right? But 53 is enough to know Mike's old, right? Kind of thing. And so what we always talk about these measures, it's like what's fit for purpose, what's good enough, right? And that you don't over prescribe and the need for this information, but it's good enough that it's useful. So there's a lot of work to be done in this space, but there's a lot of movement we're seeing from agencies in terms of really recognizing the value of this source of information. So that's what we have for you today. We can maybe stop sharing unless somebody has a screen we want to go back to, or
No, not at all. If you don't mind stopping the screen share, that was wildly useful. Megan, thank you so much for sharing all of that information with us. Perhaps for a bit of additional background for the two of you, in addition to attending these weekly meetings, our fellows are expected to conduct an independent research study of their own related to policing and public safety in their communities. So for the fellows, one, I want to invite your questions, comments, concerns about this, but also want to challenge you to, while not going into as much depth as the folks at RTI have done, but to elicit additional perspective into what the needs within your communities might be related to these issues that we're focusing on as part of the fellowship and the consortium as a larger entity. So I recognize that last week I gave you some instruction around how you might identify what your research project might be, but let's also try to include the voices of individuals most impacted by our policing and public safety representatives within our communities. So while you may be drawn to the fellowship based off of a desire to learn more about perhaps policing technologies or various themes that have already been identified, I think it would be great to ask folks who may not be as closely associated with the fellowship around what it is that they have experienced, what they may be seeing as some areas for additional work or research in your communities to ensure that their voices are also included in the work that you're doing either this semester or this year. And I also wanted to flag, recognizing that she is not in the Zoom room today, but we do have Morgan from Roger Williams University, who earlier, well, starting in the spring semester, she conducted a survey of the Bristol police, I believe, recognizing that, thank you, Andy, appreciate the nod, that they had recently rolled out new body worn cameras. And so wanting to get a better read on what the officers themselves thought about that new policy and the deployment of that new technology within their department. And we were actually just talking yesterday about whether there would be value in her this semester conducting a community perception around the deployment of that technology. And while I always think that there's value in those types of surveys to include the voice of the community members, I did provide a bit of caution around the novelty of that deployment. And so recognizing that many individuals had been aware of that policy being rolled out, they may not have had sufficient time to experience either any real change. So I wanted to make sure that there was sufficient time that had lapsed before any of that additional insight was sought. So I wonder, in thinking about timelines, unless they're, well, while our fellows are putting together their questions, I wonder, in thinking through timelines, what is there a sufficient period for a department, like if they have introduced a new initiative that is in the hopes of eliciting a different reaction or response from their community, what is an appropriate time frame to determine how, if and how that is working in their vetting process?
yeah, I mean, that's a huge question along the other way. So one, one of the questions we always ask around law enforcement is what type of impact do you think it's going to have? What problem are you trying to solve? And if you don't have a big problem, it's going to be hard to detect change, right? And around community perceptions in general, they're hard to move. It takes like a huge event to move them. Now there's differences with the community members, but we see it's especially around community perceptions, it takes a lot to move the needle. in those areas. One, about exposure, like you said. So how many people are going to see the intervention, right? And so if it's related to how law enforcement engage, well, if only 10% of your community engages with a law enforcement officer directly in a given year, you got a small sample size, right? And that 10%, 90% have no engagement, may not know about the technology, may not know about the new initiative. And so their perceptions shouldn't move at all, right? And so that's why whether a general community survey or a post-contact survey might be most beneficial. So you can look at, and then, so if you do decide on like maybe something around training, de-escalation training, or, there's a lot of training about how to be nice with a law enforcement officer, right? I mean, it's about procedural justice and fairness and respect, and making sure that when you pull people over that, it's customer service, right? So you can detect that with post-contact surveys pretty easily over a 3-6 month period, assuming that you have enough volume, right? That you're pulling over enough people to get, if we start getting into sample size and statistical analysis, I'm happy to go that way, but maybe not. But it usually takes 3 to 6 months, I would say. One, officers have to be trained. They have to then start implementing it. So we often associate not only with the outcome evaluation, but a process evaluation. Are they really doing the new thing, right? Because it's hard to change behavior, especially when you talk about things like implicit bias. So implicit bias training is a huge thing. And it's these things, your behavior is implicit because you've been trained that way over 20, 30 years. And to think that a 2-day training is going to all of a sudden change your perspective or behaviors or how you approach things, probably not, right? Because so those are the types of things we think about in terms of detecting the impact of an intervention. Is that?
That's wholly valuable. Thank you so much for that. And I hope that framing is also of use to our students in thinking through what their research projects can be, and thinking about what is the ultimate outcome and output that you are hoping to accomplish through your work in the fellowship, but also through whatever your intervention might be, either with a local community, with a local policing department or a community safety provider. So I highly encourage that larger conceptualization to be applied across multiple domains in this conversation today, and I really appreciate that additional perspective. Fellows, students, what else is coming to mind? Any ideas or questions or process investigations that you want to flag for our speakers today? General impressions. Alex.
Yes, hello, sorry, and sorry, can y'all hear me?
Yeah.
All right, awesome, thank you. So first, thank you for this presentation, wildly helpful for our research that we're doing over here at Campbell University. And then my question is somewhat related to that research as well. So we were thinking about looking at the effectiveness of police training boards, and obviously we're going to comb through the research that y'all have done, but just from a starting off basis in evaluating community perception of things like that, of the methods that you've presented here today, what do you think would be a great starting point to kind of engage in that type of research?
So your intervention is oversight boards?
Yes.
Okay,
yes.
So like NACOL and community oversight boards. Yeah. So usually, so that one, in my opinion, the oversight boards are rare across 18,000 law enforcement agencies, right? They're often associated with consent decree or pattern practice, right, kind of investigation. But they're often welcomed by progressive organizations, right? Maybe not as formal as an oversight board, but community-based organization engaged on a routine basis with some level of transparency with the agency. So first, you want to know, okay, what is the scope of the intervention, right? Is there a lot? Is there a lot of media impact? Is there a lot of dissemination of reports to community groups? So just wondering how visibility is around that new relationship. Second, I think surveying the most important, closest stakeholders is probably something I would choose to do. How do you, from a law enforcement and from the community stakeholder groups that may be involved, what is your perception of this arrangement? Is it positive, negative? It didn't go, it still has work to do. To take it to the next level or community, that's a little tricky, because I think it gets to the point where how many community members know about it, right? And what are you trying to change, right? And most community board oversight is really about accountability. So if something does happen, if the most common things, like a complaint comes in, and okay, so what happened to the complaint? Was it ignored, or was some action taken? And that other things that are in place that are of interest, like everyone's getting the right training, maybe the use of force continuum, less lethal or something. So policies and practices that may not be visible to most people outside in the community. So there's kind of a multi-layered approach. I mean, I don't know if a community perception survey would match up just quite in this case.
Thank you very much. And you hit on some things that we had kind of been throwing at the wall and see if it'd stick, but it was great to hear that evaluation. So thank you.
Cool.
Anyone else? Right, well, in that case, Mike, Megan, thank you again so much for being here and really for flexing this social scientist's brain. I love hearing all about your process, the outcomes of what you have accomplished, and also anticipating the additional progress that I wholly see from the work that you have done. So thank you for being at the forefront of this work, for leading the charge, and really inspiring both myself and hopefully the rest of the class to continue in this path. So thank you for your involvement and participation today, as well as the larger work that you're doing. It was an honor to hear from you, and I look forward to seeing what happens next. And students, thank you for being a part of this conversation. I'll look forward to our call, which will be next Thursday. Let me pull up my calendar, when we will be hearing from, please hold while I vamp and pull that up. Next week we have two separate events. Next Wednesday, we have the public webinar taking place on Wednesday, October 4th from 1 to 2:30 that will focus on a recent book launch that from a publication within the American Bar Association entitled Constitutional Policing. We'll have 3 speakers who are also contributing authors to that book in a moderated conversation by Dean Jelani Jefferson from the University of Detroit Mercy. That should be a really interesting conversation around the value of this book for both practitioners as well as students. And then on Thursday, October 5th from 3:30 to 5 p.m., we will hear from one of the faculty advisors from the Consortium Fellowship Program, Lauren P. Golden, and she'll be talking about the case for crime-specific reasonable suspicion. So that will be 2 very compelling discussions for us to participate in next week. So thank you very much for your involvement and for being present today. If you have any questions, comments, concerns for me in the meantime, don't hesitate to reach out. Otherwise, I will see you all here next week.
Thanks all.
Thank
Cheers.
you.